semi-naked, brutal, full of tattoos, with axes and swords, screaming and pillaging, setting things on fire, jumping from the longships to the shore, and chasing monks, women, children, and animals. Quite the image we have for the Vikings, isn't it? This is quite the image we have of the Norse people and the Vikings, isn't it? Well, join me here to find out what these people cooked and ate. Hello, welcome back to another archaeogastronomical adventure. I'm your host, Thomas Dinas, and this is the Delicious Legacy Podcast, a podcast where we explore the flavors and the tastes of the past, of long-forgotten recipes and ingredients of almost all the major ancient civilizations. What did our ancestors eat and why? And what common foods are in the different continents and in the different countries around the world. Join me as we explore the most unusual recipes from the past. But firstly, let me remind you that you can find the podcast on Spotify, on Acast, on Amazon, on YouTube, on Apple Pods, Google Pods, and so on. And as the podcast is free to download, please rate and review it if you can, and spread the word. Share it with 3 friends and with your family, and make sure that you watch the amazing ancient food recipe videos I've got on YouTube. These you'll find by typing my name, Thomas Dinas, and the Delicious Legacy. So, anyway, let's go back to our food exploration of another era 1,000 or so years ago. Fame has it that they were fearless and brutal warriors out of Scandinavia, raiding and trading. Who were they and what did they eat? Yes, we are talking about what we call today Vikings. Norse peoples from Scandinavia, roughly on today's Norway and Denmark mainly, but also Sweden, from the 8th until the 11th century. Peoples who were excellent navigators and traders, and of course many other common professions of the time. And yes, indeed they were raiders too, some of them, not all of them. I guess the most adventurous they went out of Scandinavia to find their fortune. But yeah, firstly, let's dispel with the myth of Vikings and horns and all that stuff. They never had horns. That's a very 19th century image made for an opera from a costume designer. Anyway, in the Old Norse language, a Vikinger was a person who was going to an expedition. And people back then were as mobile as with many other ages that we've explored in past episodes. They knew about the things that they were out there, and curious people were going out there to find out themselves. And of course, raids were also a very good business. Lo, it is nearly 350 years that we and our fathers have inhabited this most lovely land, and never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race, nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold the church of St. Cuthbert, spattered with blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain is given as prey to pagan peoples. This is Alcuin, a senior advisor to Charlemagne, the most powerful king in Europe then, in a letter writing to the king of Northumbria, expressing his shock and horror at the attack of the monastery of Lindisfarne. It was early June of 793 when that happened, and that kick-started the so-called Viking Age. The woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne Island by fierce robbery and slaughter. Writing in the next century, the chronicler Symeon of Durham wrote, "They miserably ravaged and pillaged everything. They trod the holy things under their polluted feet. They dug down the altars and plundered all the treasures of the church. Some of the brethren they slew. Some they carried off with them in chains. The greater number they stripped naked, insulted, and cast out of doors, and some of them they drowned in the sea." Yet this image of Norsemen and Vikings is only partially true, of course. As with everybody else, there were farmers and traders and, of course, many other professions of the time. Some of the most adventurous of them, they left the lands of Scandinavia to go for trading and plundering and raiding, which was part of a good business back then. Viking Age cooking gear included large pots for boiling, hooks and spits for roasting, and ovens for baking. Frying pans and warming griddles were also known. Eating utensils were the knife and the spoon. Some Viking Age spoons had fairly flat bowls, making them more shovel-like than modern soup spoons. Presumably, these were used to eat foods with the texture somewhere between roasted flesh, eaten of course with the help of a knife, and the broth resulting from cooking this flesh. In the cold, harsh land of Scandinavia, mealtime was usually twice a day. The first being in the morning, and was called dagmal, and when the day's work was done, in the evening, nattmal. The Norse society, the Norse culture, was mainly existing as an agricultural society, and the typical Viking diet was well-rounded and included an abundance of meat, vegetables, fruits and grains. Reindeer, goat, elk, mutton, poultry and fowl were readily available, but on occasion there was also beef, lamb and pork, and these were the preferred choice in a Viking household. The most common drink was ale, for men, women and children, and an alcoholic dairy-based beverage known as sira, which is a byproduct of making skyr, the famous yoga-type dairy product. Mead, which is a honey-based drink, and wine from grapes, which was imported from places like Germania or Francia, were both expensive and out of reach of most people. Some sort of Scandinavian wines existed, and they were fruit-based. So something like apple wine and strawberry wine was occasionally drunk. And of course, as we said, ale and syrah and mead. Mead being the most rare of all, because honey was the most expensive of these elements. Agricultural technology in Scandinavia was fairly primitive during the Viking Age. The metal plough was unknown in Scandinavia, and the fields were cultivated using an ard plough, also known as ard, a light plough with a wooden spiked share which cut the soil. This was pulled by an ox and steered by the farmer. The big long scythe we know from most medieval representations of peasants didn't exist as well, so the fields were harvested using small hand scythes. And the winters were harsh and cold, but generally the people were toiling in the land. There were many farmers. Barley was the dominant crop overall, except in Jorvik, which is modern-day York, where wheat was dominated. There was a period for about 100 years in the 9th century where Vikings had conquered the north of England, and York was their capital, and they named it Jorvik. And the dominant crop was wheat. But anyway, they used barley mainly to brew beer, but also to make porridges and stews, and to a lesser extent bread. The availability depended on a variety of factors, such as the climate, of course, and soil conditions. Barley, for example, is more of a hardy crop, right? As we've seen in other episodes and about the beer and all that stuff, and can tolerate the colder climates of northern Norway. Imports of grains or lentils and millet and spelt is also evidenced in the archaeological record, though one can assume that was mostly a high-status food. Indeed, talking about archaeological evidence, most of them, if not all, the vast majority anyway, of our evidence for Viking food and recipes comes from archaeological records and discoveries, and not much in terms of recipes had been written down and survived to our age. Prior to the Viking Age, line seeds were harvested for food. Line seeds, along with camelina seeds, played a small part in the Viking Age diet. Most likely, the primary purpose of growing flax seeds was for linen production. Peas were also grown, but harvested after drying so that they could be used throughout the year and even powdered into pea flour. Bread was typically small, round and flat. Rye was used mainly, and maybe wheat in some leavened breads, with white flour being obviously one of the most high-status ingredients. Ribbed baking plates of Norwegian soapstone were found in Aarhus in Denmark. The ribbed or the raked lines serving as an early equivalent of a non-stick tray. Meanwhile, the bread at Birka was found with small oblong loaves strung on a metal wire. Birka is a Viking Age city settlement which is situated on the island of Björkö in the Lake Mälaren in Sweden, obviously. And there, the archaeologists found remains of the city, and there is a lot of evidence about Viking Age foods there. Also, another interesting thing regarding bread in Norse culture is pine bark bread, which basically something that the Old Norse people ate, and it's a tradition that probably came from the Sami people of northern Scandinavia. Sami people live in Finland today, where is North Finland and North Sweden, and perhaps even in the Russian Arctic. Anyway, what they used for that bread, it was not the hard outer bark of the pine or the birch trees, but the inside, the green soft one. Fruit-wise, there were plenty of options such as crab apples, pears, plums, cherries, blackberries, lingonberries, bilberries, wild strawberries, raspberries, elderberries, rose hips, gooseberries, and of course, many more. Further north, one could also find cloudberries. The varieties available depended on the parts of northern Europe where the plants could grow. Some fruits, obviously grapes and peaches that were found in some archaeological sites, were more than likely an imported food. Cabbage, turnips, kale, leeks, onions, angelica, carrots, peas and broad beans are some of the vegetable crops grown in gardens or harvested in the wild. It wasn't uncommon to have cabbage garden alongside one's house, but it was likely more just cabbage that was grown there. Garlic as we know it was likely imported, while a close equivalent, the ramsons or wild garlic, which is pretty popular nowadays, could be grown in southern Scandinavia. Sorrel, which is a spinach-like leafy green herb, which I grow as well in the garden, it's very easy to grow. It's lemony and very sharp in taste. Was found in places like Lerje in Denmark, alongside with broad beans, hazel and peas. Obviously, mushrooms were also grew in the forests of Scandinavia, and they must have been used as part of the diet of the foragers and hunters. Meat-wise, all evidence suggests that cows were only eaten after they had stopped giving milk. So the same can be said it's true for sheep with their wool and goats. Skyr is a traditional and popular yogurt type or cheese type dairy product from Scandinavia. It does indeed have the consistency and flavor that reminds many people of yogurt. However, skyr is made much like cottage cheese or cream cheese, using rennet to congeal the milk solids and allow the whey to be separated. Thus the Swedish name, which translates as fresh cheese. True skyr is made with unpasteurized buttermilk. The fresher the buttermilk, the better the results will be. In Iceland, skyr is properly made by adding a little skyr to the new mixture, which inoculates the new batch with all the special cultures that make up the flavor of skyr. A similar result may be obtained elsewhere by adding sour cream to the mixture. I'll be back after this short break.
Hello there, sorry to interrupt. My name's Dr. Neil Buttery and I'm host of the British Food History Podcast, a podcast that you, as a fan of the delicious legacy, might be interested in. I explore British food and its history in all its glory, with interviews with special guests, recipes, reenactments, and tracking down forgotten recipes and hyper-regional specialities. Previous topics include medieval eels, 18th century dining, curry, London street food sellers, breakfast, and the good old Yorkshire pudding. Search for the British Food History Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to the delicious legacy. Cheers!
Today's episode is brought to you with the welcome support of Malbin Greek, UK's leading Greek delicatessen supplier and distributor of premium Greek produce. Whatever your needs, Malbin Greek has you covered. You can shop online and have the divine and delicious goods delivered to your doorstep across the UK, or you can visit the shop at Arch 17 Apollo Business Park, Lucy Way, SC16 4ET, Bermondsey, London. Malbin Greek, the one-stop shop for your Greek fix. Most meat dishes came from wild game that was hunted, such as rabbits, wild boar, elk, deer, seabirds, bear, reindeer and squirrels. Pigs were also kept as a meat source, and horse meat was also eaten only rarely, of course, because horses were highly prized and very, very expensive. Obviously, all the farmers and people living on the farm will be familiar with butchering their own livestock, while town folk will have to visit a meat market. In Aarhus, in Denmark, there was one such known meat market, just 7 kilometers from the edge of the town. Analysis on cow and horse bones indicate that the slaughter typically occurred after an advanced age, as we said, where the animal could no longer serve its purpose in the farm or to give milk and so on. There's no evidence of wild game there. Swedish culinary archaeologist Daniel Serra, which has a book about Viking food, mentions that fresh meat would likely have been consumed at festive occasions, while preserved meats would be the norm for most of the year. I'll post some links on my Patreon page with more information about this, so please check there. The way to preserve meat includes the familiar ones like smoking and salting and drying or packing it in whey. While most meats were cut into small bites for the stews, larger cuts for festive or upper-class meals could have been roasted on a spit, for which a few examples exist. Now this whey pickles, it's a traditional Icelandic way of storing food, and meat of course, which is to submerge it in whey. As whey is highly acidic, the environment is far too acidic for meat to decompose. Instead, the proteins may break down somewhat, as when marinating. In order to do this, it is important that the meat is completely submerged into the liquid, so that no oxygen reaches it. Although it's almost impossible to know if this method was in use already in the Viking Age, whey seems to have played an important role in the cuisine at the time. The storage methods available at the time would not have posed any problems, even if the clay vessels would require constant refills of the whey. A tantalizing contemporary source of information about the Viking Age or late Iron Age can be found through many runic inscriptions. Some of those even refer to food in one way or another. Now, runic is a writing system which was developed in Northern Europe, in Germanic and Norse peoples. And there are quite a few of them surviving around. Among the earlier inscriptions, which date back before the Viking Age, as we said, some examples found include the words alu or laukas, ale and lik, respectively, either each word by itself or in some combination. As they appear on different objects that are not generally associated with food, the meaning of these inscriptions is difficult to interpret. There's another more mundane inscription, dated to the late Viking Age this time, that's found on a rib excavated in Sweden, stating that the king is most generous with food. This kind of statement is rather common, though usually carved as an epitaph over the person to whom a runic stone has been erected. In such cases, the inscription would state something like, "So and so was free with food." and an eloquent speaker. Unlike me. Norse people had 3 major feasts per year. Sigrblot was held in late spring, Vertablot in late summer, and Jolablot in midwinter. Blot means sacrifice or offering, and a horse was sacrificed at the start of each feast. It would then be roasted over an open fire on a giant spit. Other animals, including deer, pigs, and cattle, might be roasted too. Stews, vegetables, and breads were served on the side. A feast sometimes lasted 10 days or more. Singing, dancing, drinking, and telling stories of the old gods were recited throughout the long nights. And people wore the best clothes they had for these feasts. A typical Scandinavian delicacy is a dish known as lutefisk, and for centuries Scandinavians prepared it. It's a dried white fish, typically cod, prepared in lye, which is a caustic substance, basically, which can dissolve bodies. And basically, janitors use it to clean clogged drains. So this is a very unique technique that the Vikings used, and we have to thank them. Basically, with this technique, they rehydrate the dried fish in alternating containers of water and lye. There is the origin story of this, recounting a Viking raid on a group of fishermen who had left their cod out to dry on birch racks. The raiders started to burn everything, even the fish, but then a rainstorm swooped in. The scorched seafood, soaked in rain puddles, with that mix of birch ash for months, until another group of Vikings found the cod and cooked up a feast. Of course, that's a fanciful story. Probably the more mundane truth is that they used this method of drying and rehydrating fish to get over the lack of salt, lack of local deposits of salt that's used in other parts of Northern Europe for drying and preserving fish. As a result of these lengthy periods of soaking in water and lye, the cod takes on a jelly-like consistency. If not prepared by an experienced chef, it will also emit a pungent ammonia-like aroma, very similar apparently to the Icelandic's dried fermented shark. I haven't tried it, so I cannot really comment more upon it. But yeah, the flavor, however, is subtle and cries out for condiments. So Norwegians, to this day, they use traditionally melted butter, so they lather it with melted butter, while the Swedes add white sauce. I'll post some links on my Patreon page with more information about this, so please check there. Now I have a couple of very nice recipes for you from the Viking Age. So one is using hare or rabbit, which is typical game of the era. You can serve up to 6 people, but if you're 4 hungry lads, then it's going to be good enough for you. So you'll need some lard, like 50 grams of lard, let's say, or some other fat of the era. About 1.5 kilos of hare or rabbit, jointed. About 0.5 kilo of washed and trimmed leeks, slice them thickly. 6 cloves of garlic, chopped finely. About 175 to 200 grams of pearl barley or some oats. 3 3/4 cups of water. About 3 tablespoons of crabapple vinegar, which, of course, if it's difficult to find, or find some cider vinegar or something like that, or white wine vinegar will do. But obviously, that's not going to be as authentic as crabapple vinegar. A couple of bay leaves, some salt, and some sage leaves, and then I would obviously pepper would be nice to put, but for reasons of authenticity, perhaps you would like to use something like some juniper berries, dried juniper berries crushed, and melt the butter or the lard, whatever fat is, in a frying pan, in a heavy pan. Fry the meat with the leeks and the garlic. until the vegetables are slightly softened and the meat is brownish. Add the barley, water, vinegar, bay leaves and the seasoning. Break the pot to the boil, cover it and simmer it gently for at least an hour, maybe an hour and a half. You'll see when the meat is really tender and falls from the bone. Add the sage near the end and let it cook for a few more minutes, like 5-7 minutes simmering. And then taste it, adjust the seasoning if you want some, and serve. Another lovely recipe from the era is small bird and bacon stew with hazelnuts, which were a valuable source of energy and food source at the time. So get 6 fatty, thick rashers of bacon, chop them roughly, 3 cloves of garlic, get 4 pigeon breasts or like 4 small game birds, something like quails perhaps, 250 grams of mushrooms, some wild forest variety of mushrooms is ideal, some 75 to 100 grams of hazelnuts, toasted and roasted or toasted and then chopped, 300 milliliters of some real ale, 150 milliliters of water, 2 bay leaves, of course salt as much as you need, some black pepper, but as I said earlier is not exactly authentic, and 6 coarse slices of rye bread or brown bread. So fry the bacon with the garlic until it's lightly browned in a heavy casserole. Add the birds and brown on all sides. Add the mushrooms and the nuts. Continue to cook for a couple of minutes. Then add the ale and the water with the bay leaves. Bring to the boil, cover and simmer very gently until the birds feel cooked and falling off the bone. Remove the birds from the juices. Cool the juices completely and remove any excess fat. And serve the whole bird on top of the piece of bread with plenty of the juices and the rest of the bits, and some salad of wild greens as an accompaniment. Now there's another recipe, a chicken stew with beer, which comes from the Vikings feast, and that will give you a serving for at least 4 people, I think. So you need a nice organic chicken, 3 to 4 carrots. If we want to keep it authentic, let's try and find some white carrots or some yellow carrots. Orange carrots is a later invention. 3 yellow onions, 1 large turnip, about 1.5 teaspoons of salt, some black pepper, thyme, 6 to 8 whole juniper berries, and get yourself 1 bottle of dark beer, which is about 340 milliliters. So chop the chicken into 8 pieces, peel and cut the vegetables into pieces, fry the chicken in some fat, about 5 minutes on each side, season with salt and black pepper and place it in a pot, add the vegetables, the herbs, thyme and juniper and beer, and let boil for about 30 minutes or until the vegetables are tender, and serve the dish with bread. So this is it for today, a short introduction to Viking age food and recipes. We will delve into more exciting elements of the Norse cuisine later on this year with more in-depth Viking stuff, where we're going to go and explore the influence of the Norse around Europe and the Mediterranean, of course. We'll see the Normans of France and Sicily, the Rus, the Varangians of Constantinople, and of course Ireland and Iceland and Greenland. Remember, if you want the episodes early and ad-free, to subscribe to Patreon for $3 a month. Thanks for listening. I've been Thomas Dinas, and this was the Delicious Legacy Podcast. See you soon for more archaeogastronomical adventures.